You're standing at the base of Mount Uhud, 625 CE. Dust clings to your throat. Blood stains the sand. The prophet lies wounded. His people are running. This wasn't just a battle. This was a gut punch to an empire in the making. They thought the war was over, but they didn't know what was coming. Welcome back to Crimes of the Crown. I'm your host, Chris. And before we dive into one of history's most pivotal military disasters, smash that like button. Because today, we're not just talking about a battle. We're talking about hubris, pride, and how 50 archers changed the course of human history. Picture this: Medina, 624 CE, a city that had become a safe haven for a small, growing community of believers. Just a few years earlier, the Prophet Muhammad had made the hijrah, the migration from Mecca to Medina, to escape persecution. And here, in Medina, he wasn't just a prophet anymore. He was a statesman, a judge, a military commander, the leader of a fragile coalition held together by faith, politics, and pure necessity. Think of it like this. Imagine you're the CEO of a startup that's just gone public. Suddenly, everyone's watching. Your competitors want you dead. Your board is split. Half your employees are loyal. The other half? They're updating their LinkedIn profile. That was Muhammad in Medina. It wasn't perfect. The Aus and Khazraj tribes, longtime enemies who'd been bleeding each other dry for generations, had agreed to a truce. But old grudges die hard. Some allies were loyal, others, not so much. But things were growing, changing. The community was finding its footing. And then came the news that changed everything. March 624 CE, the Battle of Badr. A small Muslim force, maybe 300 fighters, faced off against the Meccan army of nearly 1,000. The Meccans had everything: superior numbers, better equipment, cavalry, experience. But the Muslims had faith, and apparently that was enough, because they won, decisively. Picture David versus Goliath, except David brought 299 friends and Goliath brought a corporation. Abu Jahl, the Meccan war chief and Muhammad's personal nemesis, died on that battlefield. So did dozens of Quraysh nobles, men whose names carried weight from Syria to Yemen. The Muslim world exploded with celebration. Divine intervention, they cheered, proof that their cause was just. But in Mecca, silence. The kind of silence that comes right before someone throws a chair through a window. Abu Sufyan ibn Harb was not a man who accepted failure gracefully. Imagine Jeff Bezos, but with a sword and a serious anger management problem. Abu Sufyan was the closest thing the Quraysh had to a king, merchant prince, political mastermind, and after Badr, completely humiliated. His business partners were dead, his trade routes were compromised, his reputation in tatters. But Abu Sufyan was patient, methodical. He didn't want revenge. He wanted annihilation. So he started making calls, sending messages, calling in favors. The Thaqif tribe they were in, still bitter about their losses at Taif. The Kanana, they'd lost kinsmen at Badr, and they wanted blood. Bedouin mercenaries from across the peninsula, for the right price, they'd fight anyone. But this wasn't just about numbers. Abu Sufyan was planning something different, something psychological. He brought the women. In Arabian culture, women didn't typically join military campaigns. But Abu Sufyan wasn't planning a typical campaign. He brought wives, daughters, mothers of the men who died at Badr. And leading them all, Hind bin Utbah, his wife, a woman with the kind of fierce intelligence that could start wars or end them. Hind wasn't coming to watch. She had scores to settle. Her father, Ataba ibn Yaba, had died at Badr. So had her brother, Al-Walid. She'd spent a year in mourning, and now it was time for payback. The women brought drums, poetry, war chants. They turned this military expedition into a cultural event, a festival of vengeance. But Hind brought something else, a promise. If she found the man who killed her father, a Muslim warrior named Hamza, she would make him pay in ways that would echo through history. By early 625 CE, Abu Sufyan had assembled something unprecedented: 3,000 fighters, the largest army ever fielded by the Quraysh. But this wasn't just about size. This was about sending a message. 700 cavalry, the cream of Arabian horsemanship, led by a young warrior named Khalid ibn al-Walid, tactical genius who moved across battlefields like he could read the future. Archers from the Kanana tribe, men who could put an arrow through a coin at 50 paces, and foot soldiers from across the peninsula, each one carrying a grudge, a debt, or a promise. The caravan stretched for miles, camels loaded with supplies, horses that cost more than most men to earn in their lifetime at the time, weapons that gleamed like promises of death. And at the center of it all, Abu Sufyan himself, the merchant who'd become a warlord, the politician who'd chosen war. They were coming for Medina, and they weren't planning to leave anyone alive to tell the story. Muhammad knew they were coming. Intelligence networks in 7th century Arabia were surprisingly sophisticated. Bedouin tribes were constantly moving, trading information along with goods. A force of 3,000 men doesn't stay secret for long, and the city held its breath. Medina had maybe 1,500 fighting-age men. Maybe. And that was counting teenagers and grandfathers. The Prophet called a council of war, and immediately the room split. The older men, veterans of tribal warfare, survivors of decades of conflict, they wanted to stay put, fight from the city, turn Medina into a fortress. Let them come to us, they argued. Make them fight in our streets, our alleys. Every doorway becomes a trap. Every rooftop becomes an archery position. It was smart, defensive, the kind of strategy that usually wins wars. But the younger warriors, the men who'd missed Badr, they were having none of it. We didn't miss the greatest victory in our history just to hide behind walls, they said. Let us meet them in the field, show them what Muslim steel can do. These weren't just words. This was pride, honor, the kind of masculine bravado that gets people killed. And Muhammad? He found himself caught between wisdom and morale. But here's something most people don't know about early Islamic leadership. It was surprisingly democratic. Muhammad didn't just issue orders. He consulted. He listened. He respected the majority's voice, even when he disagreed with it. After hours of debate, the vote was clear. They would march out to meet the Meccans. The Prophet, respecting the will of his people, agreed. But you can bet he spent that night planning for every possible disaster. They would take 1,000 men, leave the rest to defend the city, and they would choose their ground very carefully. Mount Uhud sits about 4 miles north of Medina, a massive craggy hill that dominates the landscape, perfect for defensive positioning. But as they marched, Muhammad made a discovery that must have felt like a punch to the gut. Abdullah ibn Ubay, one of his supposed allies, a man who'd been angling for political leadership in Medina before Muhammad arrived, suddenly announced he was having second thoughts. "This is folly," he declared. "We should be defending our homes, not chasing glory in the desert." And with that, he turned around, took 300 men with him, just walked away. 1/3 of the army gone, just like that. Now you might think this was cowardice, and maybe it was. But Abdullah was also making a calculated political move. If Muhammad failed at Uhud, Abdullah would be there to pick up the pieces. Politics in the 7th century was a blood sport. The 700 remaining Muslims took position near Mount Uhud, and Muhammad showed why he was more than just a spiritual leader. He was a military strategist. The mountain formed a natural barrier at their back. No one could outflank them from behind. A narrow valley. The Meccans would have to attack uphill, into Muslim spears and arrows. But there was one weak point, a small hill to the west, high enough to command the battlefield, but close enough to rain arrows down on anyone who controlled it. Muhammad placed 50 of his best archers on that hill, led by Abdullah ibn Jubayr, a veteran who understood the stakes. The orders were crystal clear. Don't move. Not for loot, not for victory, not if you see us winning, not if you see us losing. Hold that line, no matter what. Because Muhammad knew something about warfare that his enemies had forgotten. Battles aren't won by the boldest charge or the sharpest sword. They're won by the soldier who follows orders when chaos erupts. March 23rd, 625 CE. Dawn. The Meccan army spread across the valley like a dark tide. 3,000 men in perfect formation. Cavalry on the flanks, archers in the center, infantry ready to roll forward like an avalanche. The Muslim line looked pitiful by comparison. 700 men, many of them farmers and shopkeepers a few years earlier. But they had something the Meccans didn't expect. Discipline. Traditional Arabian warfare started with individual challenges. Champions stepping forward to fight single combat while their armies watched. But Muhammad had read his Sun Tzu. He understood that psychological warfare was just as important as physical combat. Instead of individual duels, he launched a coordinated assault. Muslim archers sent volleys into the Meccan ranks, not timed shots, suppressing fire. Keep their heads down, disrupt their formation. But then came the infantry charge, not wild and not undisciplined, controlled, methodical, like a spear thrust aimed at the heart of the enemy line. And it worked. The Meccan front line cracked. These were the same warriors who dominated Arabian battlefields for generations, men who'd grown up with swords in their hands, and they were falling back. The Muslim left flank, led by young warriors hungry for glory, smashed through the Meccan right. The center held and then advanced. Even the cavalry, Abu Sufyan's pride and joy, couldn't find an opening. For a moment, it looked like Badr all over again. Divine intervention and possible victory. The Meccan camp was in sight, tents full of treasure, camels loaded with supplies, the spoils of war just waiting to be claimed. And that's when everything went to hell. Picture this. You're one of the 50 archers on that hill. You've been standing there for hours, watching your friends fight and die below. Your bow is ready, your position is secure. And then you see it. Victory. Clear, obvious victory. Your comrades are charging through the enemy camp. Gold spilling from torn bags, camels scattered, the Meccans running like rabbits. The battle is over. It's won. So what's the harm in going down to claim your share of the loot? Abdullah ibn Jubair, the archer commander, screamed at his men to hold position, reminded them of their prophet's orders. But 40 of them didn't listen. They saw treasure and forgot discipline. They abandoned their post and ran towards the spoils, leaving 10 archers. 10. To guard the most critical position on the battlefield. Khalid ibn al-Walid was 25 years old, a natural-born killer with the tactical mind of Napoleon and the instincts of a wolf. He'd been probing the Muslim flanks all morning, looking for an opening, any weakness he could exploit. And suddenly, there it was. The hill was empty, or nearly empty. 10 archers where there should have been 50. Khalid didn't hesitate. He gathered his cavalry, the best horsemen in Arabia, and led them straight through the gap. What followed was a masterclass in shock warfare. Imagine you're a Muslim foot soldier, bent over a bag of gold, celebrating victory. The battle is won. Your friends are laughing. The enemy is defeated. And then you hear it. Hoofbeats, coming fast. You look up and see death riding towards you. Khalid ibn al-Walid and 200 cavalry, moving like a steel hurricane right towards you. Horses tearing through foot soldiers who had no time to form ranks. Spears punching through leather armor. Swords cutting down men who still had coins in their hands. The Muslim rear collapsed in minutes, but the cavalry didn't stop there. They kept moving, circling around, hitting the Muslim main force from behind. And suddenly, the hunters became the hunted. In warfare, there's something called the fog of war, the confusion that descends when battle plans meet reality. At Uhud, that fog became a hurricane. Muslim units caught between the Meccan front line and Khalid's cavalry shattered like glass. Some tried to retreat to the mountain, others attempted to reform ranks. Most just ran. And in the middle of it all, Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, surrounded by enemies, his face bloodied by a thrown stone, his helmet driven into his cheeks by a sword blow, a tooth shattered. Someone in the chaos screamed the words that had nearly ended Islam before it began. The prophet is dead. That scream, the prophet is dead, rippled through the battlefield like wildfire. And some Muslims believed it and ran, but not all. This is where heroes are made, not in victory, but in the moment when everything falls apart and someone chooses to stand anyway. Talha ibn Ubaidullah, a young merchant who left his shop to follow a prophet, threw himself over Muhammad's body, took blade after blade, shielding his leader with his own flesh. His hand was paralyzed by a sword thrust, his body opened by a dozen wounds, but he held the line. Amara, Nusayba bint Kaib, a mother who'd come to tend the wounded, grabbed a fallen sword and fought like a lioness protecting her cubs. She took 13 wounds that day. 13. And she kept fighting. Abu Dujana, a warrior known for his distinctive red headband, formed a human shield around the prophet with his own body. Together they created a small island of resistance in an ocean of chaos. Long enough for their survivors to retreat. Long enough for Islam to survive. But the cost was devastating. 70 Muslims died that day. 1/10 of their force. But it wasn't just the numbers. It was who died. Hamza ibn Abdul Muttalib, Muhammad's own uncle, his foster brother, his closest friend. They called him Asad Allah, the Lion of God, a warrior who'd never lost a fight, a man who could split a skull with his bare hands. Washi ibn Harb, an Ethiopian slave trained for one mission, had been tracking Hamza all morning, waiting for the perfect moment. One javelin throw, perfect aim, perfect timing. The Lion of God fell, and then came Hind. Remember Abu Sufyan's wife, the woman with scores to settle? She found Hamza's body on that battlefield, and what she did next became the stuff of legend and nightmare. She took a knife, slashed him open, and ripped out his liver. And according to every historical source we have, Christian, Muslim, and pagan, she tried to eat it, raw, still warm. The taste was too much, apparently, even for her rage, and she spat it out. But the message was sent. This wasn't just war. This was vengeance with teeth. As the sun set over Mount Uhud, the Meccans held the field. But something strange happened. They didn't pursue the retreating Muslims. They didn't march on Medina. They didn't press their advantage. Maybe they thought the job was done. Maybe they feared a trap. Maybe they realized that this victory had cost them more than they expected. Because yes, they'd won the battle, but they'd also creating something dangerous. Martyrs. The Muslims gathered their dead, buried them, mourned, and then came the verses. In Islam, the Quran isn't just a book. It's a living document. Verses that responded to events, addressed crises, provided guidance in real time. And after Uhud, the revelations came like floodwater. Surah Al-Imran, chapter 3 of the Quran. Verses that didn't hide from the loss, but explained it. It was by the mercy of God that you were lenient with them. Had you been harsh or hard-hearted, they would have dispersed from around you. A reminder that leadership isn't about perfection. It's about compassion in the face of failure. Do not falter or grieve, for you will have the upper hand, if you are true believers. Not a promise of easy victory, but a promise that truth eventually wins. What befell you on the day when the two armies met was by God's permission, so that he might know the believers and the hypocrites. A divine explanation for disaster. Sometimes you have to fail to understand what you're really made of. But the harshest verses were reserved for the archers who abandoned their posts. God fulfilled his promise to you when you were routing them by his permission, until you lost heart and disputed about the order and disobeyed after he had shown you what you love. Some of you desire this world and some of you desire the next. In other words, you had victory in your hands and you threw it away for gold. It's a lesson that echoes through history. How many battles have been lost not by enemy action but by soldiers who couldn't follow simple orders? But here's the thing about history. It's not written by individual battles. It's written by who learns from their mistakes. Khalid ibn al-Walid, the man whose cavalry charge broke the Muslim line, within a few years he would convert to Islam, become one of its greatest generals, earn the title Saif Allah al-Masul, the drawn sword of God. Washi ibn Harb, the slave who killed Hamza, he spent years haunted by what he'd done. He eventually found redemption by killing Musaylima, the false prophet who threatened the Muslim community after Muhammad's death. Even Hind, Abu Sufyan's wife, the woman who tried to eat Hamza's liver, would eventually embrace Islam, stand before Muhammad and ask for forgiveness. Because history isn't neat, people aren't simple, and the arc of justice bends in ways that would make Hollywood screenwriters weep. So was Uhud a defeat? In the short term, absolutely. 70 dead Muslims, a community in mourning, enemies emboldened. But in the long term, it was something else entirely. It was a lesson in humility, a reminder that divine favor doesn't excuse human error, a scar that made the Muslim community stronger, more disciplined, and more united. Within a decade, those same Muslims would conquer Mecca. Within a century, they'd build an empire that stretched from Spain to India, not because they were perfect, but because they learned from their imperfections. So here's the question that keeps historians up at night. Could those 50 archers have changed everything? Could one better decision, following orders instead of chasing gold, have flipped the course of history? Or was this exactly how it was meant to go? A necessary failure that taught lessons victory never could. The Battle of Uhud wasn't just about military tactics or religious faith. It was about human nature, about how even the most disciplined people can make catastrophic mistakes when faced with temptation. It was about how pride comes before the fall, how disobedience has consequences, how leadership means taking responsibility for other people's failures. And maybe, just maybe, it was about how sometimes you have to lose everything to find out what you're really fighting for. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Was this divine testing or human error? Could Islam have survived if Muhammad had died at Uhud? And what other battles in history turned on a single moment of disobedience? Subscribe if you want more stories where faith, power, and pride collide in the dust of empires. This Wednesday on Crowns of the Crown, we'll be discovering the Siege of Lachish, where an Assyrian king unleashed brutal terror on the rebellious city of Lachish. See you then.